of interviews with Energion authors regarding the Apostle Paul. We're answering the question, who was Paul? Getting scholars with different perspectives on it. And so I'm going to be asking them a very similar set of questions. So let's start here. Today, my guest is Dr. Bruce Epperly. He's the author of the relevant Energion titles, Galatians Participatory Study Guide and Philippians Participatory Study Guide, as well as Transforming Acts. So he's written on a great deal of the literature that is involved. And so let's start out with that question. Welcome, Bruce.
Hey there. It's good to be here.
Good. So that's kind of our first starting point, is what is our literature? What do you regard as the Pauline epistles that you're confident were written by Paul? What would become our primary sources to answer this question?
Well, that's a good question. And of course, I think most scholars now are very confident about Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, Thessalonians, 1st Thessalonians, Galatians, and Philemon. Those are ones that folks are pretty certain about. The letters to Timothy and Titus, most scholars now, at least in the mainstream progressive realm, have some doubts about those, including some evangelical scholars, with, I think, Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians sort of in the middle. My own sense is that this doesn't discredit the others. As a matter of fact, I'm just working on a sermon on 1 Timothy, on the praying for your leaders, trying to respond in light of the election. And in those days, people didn't worry, as authors like I do, about copyrights. They didn't worry about dates. And oftentimes a letter was written, I think, as an homage or something in the spirit of Paul. And you can see that, I think, especially in Colossians and perhaps Ephesians. They're definitely Pauline in spirit.
Okay, and I would assume from that you would definitely, along with, I think, about 99% of scholars exclude the book of Hebrews from that list.
Yes, that's a whole other world entirely. That's a unique book in the whole New Testament, and I've always struggled with trying to figure out how to understand it myself.
Well, I'm in the process of revising my own study guide to that book, and I do have one author, Dr. David Allen Black, who has written a book called The Authorship of Hebrews, The Case for Paul, which is a very interesting little book. So in any case, that's part of the range of scholars that I'm trying to get into this, who is Paul. And of course, what literature you include is going to make a significant difference. Now, we, of course, go into secondary literature, but what weight do you give to the book Acts of the Apostles? You've written the book Transforming Acts, so I know that you're well acquainted with that. What weight do you give that in answering the question, who was Paul?
Well, in a way, I see Acts of the Apostles as a memoir about the early church. It includes a number of things of great interest and excludes a number of things of great interest. I'm inclined to think that its reporting of Paul's mystical experience on the way to Galatians has a good deal of history to it. Paul alludes to that, at least indirectly, elsewhere in his writings. I think its discussions of the Jerusalem Council, which Paul also speaks about, has a degree of veracity to it as well. I think he is, like any other memoir, and his memoirs of the early church, Luke, or the author, is pointing out things that speak to him. Those moments are moments definitive of the church, so while it doesn't give a complete picture of Paul, I think it gives kind of a postcard or a snapshot of Paul. There's much more to Paul than you'll find in Acts of the Apostles, but it gives a snapshot.
Okay. Well, let's just move straight forward. We're trying to cover the universe in a half an hour here. So we go to the third of the standard set of questions. And I thought this would bring Paul into a modern idea here. If you're introducing Paul as the next speaker at a conference, what might you say about him? I guess this would be what impresses you, like you said about the author of Acts. What really hits you about it?
Well, yes, and I think, again, I'll say the good things, as every introducing speaker does, that Paul is a preacher, a theologian, an evangelist, a church planter, the leader, in my mind, in the movement toward global Christianity, and somebody who knew Christ. That'd be my start.
Okay. That now, and since you were warned ahead, you have the flip side of the coin. Friend of yours is coming to you saying, we're sitting here in, let's say, Antioch, and I'm considering going on a missionary journey, mission trip with Paul. What do I expect? What might you say personally and confidentially about the personality of this man?
Oh, yes. I think the first thing would be expect the unexpected. Expect the unexpected. Expect a guy who's going to be flying on the seat of his pants most of the time, who hears a voice of God, has a dream, has a vision, for example, that brought him to Philippi, and then has great conviction that God's speaking to him. I think I'd say about Paul that he's going to tell it like it is. No punches. You'll know where you stand with him. He's not somebody who is going to whitewash the truth. He's going to tell you where things stand. He's going to understand where he is and tell you where he thinks you are. I think that I'd say that Paul is the real deal. There's no artifice about the man. When he says he knows Jesus, he believes he knows Jesus. He had a life-changing experience that brought him to knowing Jesus. He's the real deal. He's what he says he is. He has a certain degree of humility, but at times he forgets all about that. He knows he, in quotes, is the greatest of sinners on the one hand, but at other times he acts like he's the Pope and can decide things. He doesn't give always, as in the case of Galatians, any sort of credence to those who might disagree with him theologically. So I'd say Paul is a very complex person, but somebody you will not find him the master of indirection. You'll find him, in some sense, the bull in the china shop that's almost too direct. But if you're willing to stick with him, and if you've got a strong ego, hang on for the ride. It's going to be exciting. You might end up in jail.
Yeah, we might even use one of your favorite words, adventure.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt, there'd be an adventure with Paul, and you'd really never know where you were going. So if you're a person who has tolerance for adventure, tolerance for surprise, trust people who say God talks to them, Paul's your guy.
Okay. Well, let's just move right along. I think that's quite a picture that we have so far. So we come down to modern interpreters, and the interpreters of Paul are all over the place. So what would you say that modern interpreters most commonly misunderstand or misrepresent about Paul?
Yeah, I think that the main thing that I see missing in a lot of Pauline scholarship is the mysticism of Paul. I think Schweitzer once wrote a book on the mysticism of Paul, but that's underplayed. Sometimes people focus too much on the doctrinal Paul. I think that most of Paul's doctrinal beliefs had their emergence in his mystical experience of Christ on the way to Damascus. He had experience of Paul wanting to live in Christ, to know Christ, that he's somebody who, very much like the mystics in Christianity thereafter, had a direct relationship, or perceived he had a direct relationship to God that really shaped his whole faith and gave him his direction. I think that he, in contrast to the ultra progressives, I think that they need to take Paul in his context. Paul lived in the first century, so what appeared to be unguarded and sometimes difficult and misused passages of Paul on slavery and sexuality. Well, now it's Paul coming in. He's coming in to correct us, I think. Watch out, Bruce. Watch out. I'm talking about Paul, and he just called you up. But I think that when Paul is talking about sexuality, role of women, slavery, he is still a foot or two ahead of people in his culture. And all of us are creatures of culture. Now, to the more conservative people, I'd say don't get stuck on the small stuff. Paul is oftentimes the poster boy for homophobia. But if you look at that passage in Romans 1 that people get all head up about, it's really about us and not them. It's really about the brokenness of humankind, and in some ways I see that passage in Romans 1 as a bait and switch. It's a little bit like some of Jesus' parables where Paul appears to be pointing out all those bad people who've been left to their own devices, and all of a sudden he says, but you're one of them. And so I think that Paul shouldn't be the poster boy for opposition to homosexuals or homophobia. He only made one comment, to my knowledge, about it in the whole corpus, and not a particularly important one. It just simply was there in passing. I think he's oftentimes seen as the poster boy of keeping women in their place. I just was looking at Facebook this morning, and somebody was saying that apostolic church members should never think of a woman as president. Some people feel that about women as pastors of churches. And on the conservative realm, they think, well, a woman can't be our teacher. To my knowledge, Paul makes only a handful of comments, very sociological, very first century, about women. On the other hand, he sees 2 women or 3 women as highly important in the Philippians community, so important that when there was a dispute between them, he pointed it out in the letter. That's certainly not the sign of the unimportance of women in a church. And certainly Lydia, the woman in purple, was for all intents and purposes, the presider of the first church in Philippi. And in other Pauline passages, Paul speaks of women almost as colleagues of him, fellow missionaries with him, fellow teachers, fellow spiritual leaders. So I think that Paul is much more complex and should not be pinned down to a particular position. I think he's lively. I would see him actually being much more of a change agent than a bastion of traditionalism.
Okay. As we keep moving this on, clearly I think we might hit on this a little bit in the couple of final questions that I have, particularly for you from your perspective. But what do you see as Paul's primary theological sources? I'm talking about the difference in the role between what you've already referred to, his personal mystical experiences, his background in Judaism, particularly diaspora Judaism, and his background in Greek and the developing Western thought. What do you see as his primary theological sources?
Well, in an odd way, Paul is a precursor to the Wesleyan quadrilateral, I think. I think his experience is his primary theological source, to be honest, which makes Paul also rather postmodern. His experience of freedom, his experience of encountering Christ, he puts that experience up with the theology of the Jerusalem church. He sees his own experience of call as being equivalent to the orthodoxy of Jerusalem. Now, he's more than that, obviously. We know that he was well educated, at least by his own voice. He's well educated in the Jewish tradition. As a younger person, was an adherent to orthodoxy, was a persecutor of the early church. He cites the Hebraic scriptures in his writings. He's well aware of them. And yet there's a certain, beyond that rabbinical sense, for Paul, there's a certain sense of universalism. We can imagine that he was well educated, that he knew Greek philosophy. I mean, if you buy the belief that he might have been the author of Hebrews, you're getting on some pretty heavy sledding in Hebrews philosophically. And I think that he definitely knew his philosophy of the time. He's the only person, to my knowledge, who directly quotes a Greek thinker in the New Testament. I mean, you could say that to some degree the prologue of John does, but in Paul's speech in Athens, he says, the one who you live and move and have your being, at the Areopagus. Now that's as one of your philosophers has said. So I think Paul in many ways was a Renaissance person. He had his experience, He knew the Hebraic scriptures. He doesn't talk anything about the life of Jesus, and that's an interesting thing. He talks about the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. I'm sure that Paul was aware of the life of Jesus. After his conversion experience or his transformation experience on the way to Damascus, he went under the tutelage, it appears, of some of the members of the community. But he may just simply assume that everybody knows those Jesus stories, so he doesn't have to deal with them. And maybe he saw himself, like certain authors do at different times, saying, other people say that better than I do. I'm not going to waste my time on what others do better than I do. So I think he's cosmopolitan. He tradition, scripture, experience, and even to some degree the non-Christian culture enters into his thinking, because of course he's talking to Gentiles, many of whom have virtually no awareness of what's going of the Hebraic tradition, at least in any sort of formal sense. So he's a universal man, I think, a universal person, a Renaissance person.
Okay. Now, before I'm going to, I have two questions to ask you that particularly relate to you as a process theologian, but I want to make this one kind of final one that's more general. What do you think Paul might say to the American church today if he were to come in and receive a good briefing or visit a few churches and see where we are as the American church in general? I know that's a very general question.
Don't get stuck on small things. Don't get stuck on small things. Try to figure out in your church and in your faith what's really important. Whether or not all of us say that I will speak Christ and Him crucified as the center of our faith, Paul has a certain degree of relativity about a lot of issues in faith simply because he wants to put Christ first. I think take seriously spiritual practices. I think if I were to say another underestimated aspect of Paul, it would be Paul as a spiritual teacher in terms of giving practical guides posts to how we practice our spiritual life. I think that his little passage in Philippians 4 about how you can develop your spiritual life is priceless. Philippians 4:4-9. It's priceless. If anyone follows his directions there, they will have a fine relationship to God, I believe. I would say he'd also, if we update Paul 2,000 years, he'd probably say, don't get involved in the culture wars. Don't get involved in the issues about gender and race in terms of exclusion. The others belong in the church. The others should have authority in the church. The church should be a place of hospitality. That's certainly my reading of Galatians.
Okay. Now, since I published one book by you and you've written a number of others, I published Process Theology, Embracing Adventure with God, 44 pages on process theology, which I will admit is regularly referred to with astonishment, that any book on process is only 44 pages. But having made that little remark, as a process theologian, how comfortable are you writing, talking, and teaching about Paul? Is he a comfortable fit? Do you feel a little bit of strain as you do it? How does that go?
Well, I suppose some people would take more umbrage than I would. I look at Paul as a fallible person like myself, like anyone else who writes and teaches and preaches, who seeks to spread good news, that there's some issues in Paul that I wish he'd clarified. I wish that he had a better education maybe in dealing with doctrinal diversity. I wish that he had gotten some nonviolent communication skills and listened more to his opponents and learned from them perhaps. But on the other hand, Paul has a lot of good to say that I, as somebody who follows process, that can affirm. He joins theology and practice. For him, theology is profoundly practical. It's not just for your armchair with your cup of coffee. It gets you out in the street. He sees God's presence, and this probably is the most powerful thing in Paul for me, is that Paul sees God's presence active through all creation. I think Romans 8 is just a wonderful wonderful text for process theologians. Whole creation is groaning. The non-human world reflects God's care. God wants to save the non-human world. And then Paul connects the non-human world to the groanings of God moving through the depths of our hearts, and then gives the notion of God being present with us, working in all of our lives to bring something good. Again, I think that that dream of the beloved community, which is also part of Paul's thinking, you can see that in 1 Corinthians 12, particularly, and the giftedness and the inspiration of each individual, each person, is pretty powerful for any theologian to get their minds around. So I feel comfortable with Paul, warts and all. I believe that Paul has been used in ways that have not been helpful by many of Paul's followers. And I think that they've seen Paul as being less interested in ethics than in fact he was. I also wrote a little book for you on James, in which one of my suggestions was that James and Paul really weren't antagonistic, as some scholars note, that James was not critiquing Paul, he was critiquing Paulinists, people who followed Paul who didn't see the connection of faith and ethics. But Paul is pretty clear that the works of righteousness mean that your faith is worked out in your everyday life and in your larger interests.
Okay, and then one final question on this, and I think you've referred to this several times, so you may be able to answer it quite briefly, is do you feel that perhaps some progressive theologians have backed off of Paul too much? We hear the red letter Christian, which is not something that that I'm opposed. I like the idea of following the words of Jesus, but at the same time, sometimes we get that as a Jesus good, Paul bad.
Yes.
Is that at all?
Well, I think they're both pretty good. As the Doobie Brothers song says, Jesus is just all right with me, and so is Paul. And I think that part of the challenge with Paul really may not have come with Paul, but how Paul used him. I mean, obviously, Paul's considered by many the second founder of the Christian church, and that could be a very accurate statement about his impact. I mean, he did for good and for all make Christianity, if we trust him and if we trust Acts of the Apostles, a global religion, such that we wouldn't be here talking if it hadn't been for Paul. I believe that it's just that his impact is just that important. So I think we have to read Paul like we do everyone else, as being ambiguous, as being fallible, as speaking to his time and place the best he knew. And certainly Paul's emphasis on grace has been a powerful voice of healing for people in trouble. I think Paul's focus on letting the Gentiles be first class in the church, we've never followed that as well as we should have. I mean, if we really took that seriously, we probably would have a society in which we didn't need to, in my mind, appropriately say, Black Lives Matter. If the church was the headlight, as Martin Luther King says, and not the tail light in dealing with issues of equality, and I see that really as a key issue of Galatians, is saying the outsiders are just as important as you. The ones who haven't got the message first are just as important to you, as I think that Paul is really can be an important voice of liberation. And even the question of Philemon is an interesting one, because at the end of the day, I believe, as I read Philemon, even though it's been used as a terrible book, in some ways it's been used so poorly, maybe it should be taken out of the Bible, saying that with a degree of tongue-in-cheek here. But the implication I get, and I think I've been influenced a little by N.T. Wright on this point, is that when Annette goes home, Paul's saying to Philemon, this guy's a brother in Christ. Now what you going to do about it? And I think the word that Paul is saying to him is release the slave. And if somebody had heard that over the last 18 centuries, we would have been a very different world than the one we're currently living in.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I've been talking with Dr. Bruce Epperly, answering the question, who was Paul? This is the first in a series of several interviews that I'm going to record, seeking scholars with different perspectives, so that you can listen and try to hear some different voices in this. So again, thank you, Bruce.
It's a delight to be with you, Henry.
Okay, and this will be available on several resource pages and so on as I proceed with some studies on Paul using our Energion authors material.